Thanks, Bruno. So, hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Allen. I'm our strategy director at Children's Funding Project and started this project with Elizabeth Gaines back in 2018 because we saw a need for another organization at the national level who could answer questions exactly like the questions we're hoping to answer today. Before we get started, just as a few housekeeping items, note that we will definitely share the slides at the end. So we'll send those out via email once we're done. And we're also recording this webinar. I also just want to encourage folks to put questions in the chat as we go. We'll have 2 pauses for Q&A, and so I'll gather up all those questions and ask them of our panelists. I also want to just thank our friends at the Alliance for Early Success for their support and thought partnership on this webinar, and just welcome all of our Alliance for Early Success Network friends. Our goal for this webinar is to provide you with examples of state funding legislation that we hope will both inspire you to take action in pursuing significant funding for children during your next few legislative sessions, and it will give you a more concrete sense of how to do so and how some other places have done so. We hope that the examples we present will encourage you to dig into your state's revenue options and to think creatively. And I just want to note that this is a more early childhood oriented webinar, but the lessons learned and the examples we'll use cover kind of a more broad range of cradle to career purposes as well. Bruno, do you want to hit the next? Just a quick bit of context about what Children's Funding Project is. If you haven't heard of us, we're still relatively new, though I think I have to stop saying that now that we're at year 5. We're a nonprofit social impact organization, and we really focus on the question of funding. We know there's so many incredible folks in the early childhood and cradle to career child and youth fields who know what kids need in order to thrive and move from cradle to career successfully. And a big unanswered question that we saw was, okay, but how do we fund all the programs and services that children and youth need? So our organization really works on answering that question. Today, I'm really excited to introduce a new voice at the national level in this conversation. Bruno Showers is a new addition to the Children's Funding Project team. He comes to us from Arkansas, where he spent the past 5 years at Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families, leading the organization's tax and budget advocacy and lobbying efforts at the state capitol and maintaining the Arkansas Kids Count database. Bruno, I think I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you to get started.
Awesome. Yeah, appreciate that, Olivia, and thank you all for being here today. Obviously, excited to share some information with you all. So the title or the hook for this was to talk about our upcoming legislative session. I know many states have a session that's going to be starting early in next year in 2024. It's also never too early to start thinking about further legislative sessions. Even if you don't get everything you want in 2024, a lot of these tools can be used for campaigns in 2025, 2026, and on down the line. And I think one of the things you'll see as we go over these examples, and especially when we get to our guests who from the states who will kind of share their experience, is that this will be like a long haul thing. You shouldn't expect this to be done in one legislative session. You might get accomplished some significant achievements, but it'll be a long road to hoe to get what we really know kids need. So to that end, there are sort of 4 broad kinds of policies we wanted to talk about today to ensure that kids get the revenue that they need. Broadly speaking, we'll talk about creating a state level children's fund, which is kind of a vehicle for you to get some initial dedicated revenue to kids, but also to build on in future campaigns. It gives you a vehicle to put more into over time. We'll talk about dedicating recurring revenue to those funds to ensure that once they're created, that they can keep going and you can keep building on it, as I just mentioned. And then we'll talk a little bit about, depending on your state, you may need to enable local legislation, depending on the constitutionality and local fiscal autonomy that's available or existing in your state. You may need to do something at the state level to enable localities to do their own children's funds. And then we'll hear more specifically from Louisiana about incentivizing local action using state matching funds to get localities to also, basically to broaden the amount of revenue that's available for children's programs. So let's get started. So the first thing we'll talk about today is, as I mentioned, creating a children's fund. So as we mentioned, this is sort of a mechanism that ensures that there's something in place to dedicate revenue to children's programs. It gives you an administrative way to do that. So what you want to do first is create the vehicle, as we mentioned. A dedicated fund ensures that children's programs and children needs kind of stay on the legislature's mind, stay on policymakers' minds. Create it and get it short-term funding. If you can't get everything you want, the recurring big source of recurring dedicated revenue initially, at least get it something to get it going, because it can serve as like a proof of concept, and using sound management and good impacts, good investment with the fund, I think is a good political tool for campaigns to build on in future years, even if you don't get everything you want when you first create it. And so, I mentioned we're talking about state level children's funds. Obviously, it might be good for us to kind of define what we mean when we're talking about that. And so basically, this is what we're talking about. We think it's good for it to be at the state level. It's responsive to the state's political context. Also, as compared to localities, the state will have a more significant revenue base to draw upon. I mean, especially as we're looking at this cliff from the COVID relief going away, and seeing ECEs kind of has this big cliff in need for funding. Obviously, the state level is going to be necessary. Localities aren't going to be able to fill that hole themselves. Dedicate it to children's programs. Obviously, we want to make sure that we're funding children's programs. Olivia mentioned that we're kind of specifically talking about ECE here. Most of the examples are from like 0 to 3, but it's not exclusive. It's not, and it's also not exhaustive. We don't have all the examples, so that's another thing. Please let us know if we're missing something as we're going through here, and you feel your state has a dedicated fund that we've missed. Happy to incorporate that into our research going forward. And then obviously we want it to be public revenue, because ultimately it's democratically accountable to the voters in the state, right? It's public money, it's not private money. So those things are all important in our view. And so, as I mentioned, there's several states that have these kind of state level funds. As I mentioned, most of these are early childhood funds. There are examples of cradle to career, everything from after school and out of school programs to disconnected youth at older ages. But mostly we are talking about ECE when we're looking at these state dedicated funds as they currently exist. So, this is a lot of states. There's a lot of different financing mechanisms they use to create these funds that we'll get into a little bit later. A lot of them are, opportunistic. So that's one thing, is like keep your eyes open and make sure to strike when the iron's hot on some of these things. A lot of them are from like tobacco settlement funds. The legalization of cannabis products recently was also another kind of foot in the door to getting another revenue stream for children's programs. Again, we'll go into this more later, but just want to note that collectively, these are annually are investing billions of dollars into children's programs. So these funds are already there. They're already working. We just need to make sure that there's the political will to expand them into new states, which is why we're glad that you're all here today to kind of learn more about them. And so with that, I think it might be useful for us to kind of go through a couple examples from the states that have done these things, and just kind of give you a view of how they did it, link you to the legislation or a ballot initiative language that got it accomplished, so that you can kind of understand what it might take to create one of these funds and what it can do once you've gotten it. So an example of this, I think an interesting example, because it was, so in Nebraska, they have something called the Sixpence Early Childhood Endowment Fund that funds programs for children 0 to 3. And it was created in 2006 after decades of advocacy. At least I know for sure they got started in the 90s kind of working towards this idea, and finally accomplished it in 2006, which gives you kind of the idea of what time frame your campaign might be looking at as you're looking for advocating for these policies. But so they got it in 2006 with private commitment, which they used to get a public commitment. And although this is not a revenue or a fund that has a dedicated source of recurring revenue, they've managed it well. The outcomes are good enough such that even when there's been times that the fund was kind of depleted and it seemed like there might not be enough funding available to meet the need, the legislature has stepped in and funded this and given it further public revenue over the years, even during recessions. So in 2008, obviously COVID, from what I could tell, the legislature kept this commitment to ensure that 0 to 3 programs were getting funded, at least to some extent, right? I don't want to make the case that this is meeting all of our needs, but it's one of the elements, one of the ingredients to ensure that kids get the services and programs that they need. Another example, and I'm not going to be too in the weeds about this because our friends from Louisiana are here today to talk a little bit more about it, but I just want to give an example. This was created in 2017-ish. Libby will tell me if I'm wrong on the exact year, but I think it's important to note that this is something that was created without any funding available originally. And now here in 2023, it's got all of these sources of revenue. I mean, so this is to me, again, I don't want to go too much into it because I don't want to steal Libby's thunder, Louisiana's thunder, but I just think this is interesting. It really shows you how creative you can get in braiding together different sources of public revenue. It shows that it's going to take a while and you might not get everything you want, but you can build on it over time, even in a state with a political context like Louisiana. And then I think it's also important to go over the losses as well as the wins. You know, if you start in the 90s and don't get your goal accomplished until 2006, I think that's an example of how long this can take. You're not going to win every session in between those things. So this year, Montana had HB 967, which would have used coal severance money to create their own dedicated children's fund for children's programs. And although the legislation failed, I think it's important to note that that doesn't mean that the campaign was pointless or that nothing got done. So Montana had this legislation that would have created an early child fund for children's programs. And although it didn't pass, I just think it's important to note that the fight's not over, right? Like the legislatures that you got to sponsor the legislation and vote for the legislation, the partner groups that you engaged, the other grasstops and grassroots folks that were involved in the campaign. This is all just it's like you laid the foundation for next year's. And so even though this legislation didn't get where it wanted to go, it's super important that they made the ask and got it started. And you know, now they can carry that forward and build on that momentum in further legislative sessions like 2025 for them, I think. And so the next kind of pot of policies we'll talk about, or broad policy, is dedicating recurring revenue to our children's fund. Because although I've mentioned many times now that you'll have to keep going back to the well and fighting for the needs of children's programs, like that fight is never going to end. If you get recurring revenue built into the fund, that definitely lessens one of your burdens. It lets you fight on a different front. And so some of the different ways that you can get recurring revenue is rededicating an existing revenue stream. You can create a new tax for the fund, or you can increase an existing tax that's already on the books and dedicate that portion of the revenue to the fund. And so this is actually again, not exhaustive. There may have been a couple of new states that we need to add to this. And again, if we're missing something that you think your state has one of these and we're not including it, please let us know. But I just kind of wanted to give you a picture of the menu of options that different states have looked at to fund their children's programs. You can see there's some like bigger, broader things like general sales taxes or corporate activity taxes, but there's also a lot of, you kind of like just need to catch as you can on some of these things to ensure that children's programs are getting the funding they need. I think a lot of it's going to be due to your local political context and other factors like that. And so an example of another state that's done one of these things, rededicating existing revenue to their children's fund. I think most of you have probably heard of this story, so I won't belabor the point too much, but recently New Mexico had legislation that gave federal mining lease revenues to their children's fund, but also the bigger thing was a ballot initiative that dedicated some of their state's quote unquote land grant permanent fund. It didn't increase a tax that anyone was paying, but they had this fund from different land grant stuff. And so that's they increased the amount of revenue that's going to children's programs from, it was 5% of the fund went to children's programs, and it increased that to 6.25% of the fund. So increased at 1.25%, which is a significant amount of money in this context. Creating a new tax is also something you can do. So one of my favorite examples that just recently kind of survived a court challenge was Washington, which doesn't even have an income tax, created a 7% tax on capital gains to fund both public schools, but also early learning and childcare. And this year alone, it's brought in over $800 million. This is the first year that, although they passed it a little bit ago, it went through a state and then I think federal court challenge, finally got approved, and now it's hundreds of millions of dollars more revenue than they were anticipating. So, I think this was a great win. It sucks that they had to go through the court fight, although it was anticipated. And that's another, example of what I'm trying to convey, is that the fight's never over on some of these things, right? Like, even if you get the big win, this is a big win, you're going to have to do some work on the back end to make sure that it gets across the finish line. Another example of creating a new tax, Colorado, they had a ballot initiative, voters approved Prop EE, which created a new tax on certain e-cigarette vaping products. And to kind of, so not only did they create a new tax, they also increased an existing tax, kind of going back to what I said, like you need to be creative and braid together different funding sources to ensure that children's programs and funds are getting the revenue that they need. So they also increased existing taxes on tobacco and cigarette products, in addition to creating a new tax on like liquid nicotine products. And it's bringing in, over $150 million this year for children's programs, which is another great win. And this is a little bit of an older example, but just another thing that state had done, increasing their general sales tax, something South Carolina did over 30 years ago. And there hasn't been much action with it since then, but an example of how durable this can be if you get this win. Here we are, almost 40 years, feeling old, but almost 40 years after this tax passed to fund their children's programs, and it's still bringing in over $50 million in 2023, or as in 2020, which is the most recent I could find. So although the fight's never over, you can get some durable wins once you have a children's fund in place, and once it's distributing benefits and getting kids into the programs we know they need. It kind of builds a durable constituency. So those are kind of the big state level ones. I think it's also important to look at the local level. So these are local voter approved children's funds as of 2023. I think this is current, although Olivia and others will let us know in the chat if there's an updated version. And so, I mentioned earlier, one reason we're looking at the state level is because there's more significant amount of revenue available. But as we know, children's programs are always starved. They're always needing more. And so we also need to be looking not just at the state, but at the local level for ways to fund children's services. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, you may not be able to do this in your state. In some states, you may already be good to go for a locality to create their own children's fund. Voter approved children's fund. But depending on the Constitution, you may need the state legislature to give you the okay or enable you to do this. And so I think the greatest example of how this has worked was in Florida, which again, it was legislation that was signed in 86 that kind of established the procedure, enabled counties to create their own children's services councils, which kind of their local children's funds. And again, this is almost 40 years ago. And as of 2018, 44% of Florida's children were in counties that had these funds. And I was looking for the number. I know I've heard from folks in Florida that number is closer to 60% now. So like over half of the state's children are being served by these local children's funds. And that's not something that doesn't happen unless folks, advocates at the state level had fought for that to occur. This isn't the only state where this has happened. I think Colorado and Missouri also passed enabling legislation. So a few states are kind of getting there now, but I think Florida is the kind of key example in this area. And I want to talk about incentivizing local action and not just enabling it, but using state dollars as a match to incentivize localities to create and fund their own children's funds. But I'm going to leave that to our friends from Louisiana to discuss. So I think now is a good time for us to kind of pause. And if there's any questions for me to go over, Olivia, I can kind of field them now before I hand it off to Libby.
Yeah, thanks, Bruno. I saw a bunch of conversation in the chat that I just want to address quickly. Bruno, would you mind going back to the slide with the different types of legislation on them? We didn't really talk about doing this, but I feel like this is a good point of clarification. Just maybe 2 more slides to the policies to put kids first slide number 3. Thanks. We're really putting Bruno on the spot today on his first webinar with us. So I just wanted to mention, I saw some things in the chat about folks saying, and we're excited to have Jacob here in the chat to share more about New Mexico. So please scroll back up and see his chat for more of the resources he specifically would recommend to talk about New Mexico. I just wanted to note that Bruno is giving examples from different states of the 4 different types of bills that we've talked about. But I just want it to be clear that lots of states have done multiple of these, and that's what we're hoping to get at with the panelists. That, you know, Louisiana in particular is going to illustrate passing different bills to do different pieces of this. And New Mexico certainly did that. And I know there has been really excellent writing that Jacob linked to on the process of establishing an early childhood trust fund and then actually filling it with revenue from the Land Grant Permanent Fund and dedicating revenue from that. So I just wanted to mention for folks that these are not mutually exclusive. You wouldn't do one over the other, but they're often kind of a sequence or a pathway or a combination that you'd use to really dramatically increase funding for kids at the state level. Most of the questions that I have seen are actually for our panelists, Bruno, and it feels like it's probably a good time to go ahead and move on to our panelists, and then we will circle back to the questions for those folks once our Vermont and Louisiana folks have had time to share their stories with us.
Okay, appreciate that, Olivia, and thanks. Yeah, thanks for the engagement in the chat, y'all. So I think, yeah, as you said, I think it's a good time to hand it over to, or start handing it over to our panelists. I'll start with our friend from Louisiana, Libby Sunye from the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children, the executive director. Libby, am I sharing that information correctly? Please take it away either way.
You are. Thank you so much. So again, I'm Libby Sonia. I'm the Executive Director of the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children, and wanted to share with you about our Early Childhood Education Fund, which is an incentive fund. Bruno was right. It did start in 2017, and when it first started in 2017, the fund was a 2-to-1 match. So every $2 that locals raised, if there was money in this fund, the state would put $1 towards that. In 2019, we were able to adjust the incentive fund to be a one-to-one match. So for every $1 that a local brought to the table, if there was money in the fund, then it had a $1-for-$1 match. And then over time, we've garnered different revenue sources to go into the fund. So we have Harrah's, which is a land-based casino in New Orleans, that once they get to a certain percentage of revenue, that revenue can kick into the fund. We've never seen money that happen. So while it's dedicated, we've never seen money come from Harrah's casino into the fund. The Pelicans license plate is the basketball team. That bill passed in 2021 for 50% of the proceeds from the Pelican license plate to go into the fund. The license plates haven't been made yet, so that's why there's no money. We don't anticipate that being a big one, but you know, every little cent counts, and anything that we can do to support young children in our state, we want to be able to do. CBD taxes revenue has also gone into that fund, as well as fantasy sports betting. And then the sports betting tax, which is the largest revenue that has gone into the fund, was passed in 2021, where we were able to garner 25% of the sports betting revenue in that fund at a cap of 20 million. Our job now is to get rid of the cap. And so when that went into effect, That was right in the middle of COVID. And so we have, in the last a little about a year and a half, about $10 million of the money that is in the fund is coming from the sports betting revenue. And then additionally, in 2022, there was leftover K-12 funding because we under-enrolled about 9,000 students in the K-12 system. And so our governor, in his budget that did get approved, put in $40 million of leftover K-12 minimum foundation program funding into the early care and education fund, the early childhood education fund. So that's really helped to have that infusion of cash from the 2022 legislative session. Next slide. And so if you look at the breakdown of what has generated money and what hasn't, and we think about like state and local funding for ECE in our Louisiana context, you will see as of 12/1/2022, we had almost 50 million into the early childhood education fund. It's now over 50, it's about 55 million in the fund. And then we have at the time from the 2022, this was right before New Orleans passed the millage of $21 million a year for 20 years on April 30th, 2022, and that millage was passed for infants and toddlers. But that has just being realized now. So current local funding, we are around about $27-28 million of current local funding going that could be matched dollar for dollar out of the fund. And then we have seen the funding recommendations from our Early Care and Education Commission that is saying for every year for a decade that we need an investment of $115 million. So we have to really explain that to our legislature fairly often. It's not just a totality of $115 million. It's $115 million a year for 10 years, getting us close to $1 billion to be able to serve approximately 173,000 children that are at risk in our state, birth to 4. I would also say that this Early Care and Education Commission has been critically important to name and count the number of children that are at risk, served and unserved. It's let us put a dollar amount of what we think it will cost us over time to serve these kids, because we're all very good about having a scarcity mindset of saying, well, we can't put that big dollar number out there. And so this commission has helped us do that. And then this past legislative session, really exciting because we tweaked the Early Care and Education Commission. We tweaked it because the report used to be due 30 days, within 30 days of the start of the legislative session. When we tweaked this commission report, it is now due no later it has to be done within 90 days at the end of the fiscal year. So that puts, for us, our fiscal year starts July 1. So it has to be done by the end of September, which in our state budget discussions get hot and heavy in October. So the way that the commission report was done before, a month prior to session, meant that that report was virtually useless. Now with the commission report being done within 90 days at the end of the fiscal year, it puts it right in line with our budgetary process. The other thing that's important is because of all the work that we've done at the state and local level to generate revenue for early care and education, we were able to also tweak a task force that's associated with the commission. And this task force has looked at competitive compensation and revenue that the Children's Funding Project has also helped us really think about. The task force is now tasked to think about what does a formulary look like for sustainable funding. So in Louisiana, our K-12 funding, we call it the Minimum Foundation Program, MFP for short. And so this formulary that we're thinking about for birth through 4-year-olds in our state, I affectionately call it the WEFP, like We Little Babies. But what does that WEFP look like with sustainable funding, both from the local and the state level, to make sure that we have that sustainable, reliable funding? We know that in our political context, when we talk about state and local government working together, that has good airtime because it means that the responsibility is not solely on the locals and it's not solely on the state. And we know that the federal funds that we garner from our federal government are not enough to cover our kids. And so if we think about how we've generated revenue in the state of Louisiana over the last 5 years, if we think just about state funding going towards early care and education, we went from 0 5 years ago to $86 million of state revenue going in our state's budget for early care and education for seats, plus the additional about $56 million that's in the early childhood education fund. But y'all know this stuff doesn't happen overnight. It was like well over 20 years of advocacy, a lot of political jockeying, working really hard with our business community to make the economic case, because we were the first state in the country to say what it cost us as an economy and what it cost our businesses due to childcare breakdowns. And so having business help lead and bring us into rooms to have very serious discussions about why this is an economic development issue, that it's a workforce of today and tomorrow issue, has been critically important. I see all these wows, go Louisiana, y'all, we have so far to go. And while it's wildly exciting that we have done the things that we have done, we are working diligently to get more locals to invest local dollars. It can't be flow through dollars. It has to be local dollars or philanthropy to tap into this fund. Because if we can get to the point that we raise pressure enough to the point, and we're talking about other states of like almost depleting the fund, that'll raise political pressure to get more money and dedicated revenue into that fund. I often tell people, I don't care how you spend your money. And one day, if we ever legalize marijuana, I don't care what you smoke. But if we're going to generate revenue, we want to make sure that we're generating it for young children in our state so that they can not just survive, but actually thrive.
That was great, Libby. Thank you so much. Yeah, note perfect. And I think we're about to hand it over to Vermont. Before we do, just note that Libby, you mentioned that you got a lot of stuff done and folks are happy for you, but the fight's not over. I think that's also something you're going to see echoed in Vermont, and I think across the country with ECE advocates, is that there's always going to be farther to go. Kind of balancing that is like the advocates' perennial challenge, right? Like how happy to be over this first win versus like how much to keep pushing and kind of have to do both. So that we'll have give an opportunity for questions a little bit later. But let's hand it over now to our friends from Vermont. Drake Turner and Jen Horowitz are going to talk about the campaign from Let's Grow Kids and how they got their childhood fund going. Take it over, y'all.
Thanks so much, Bruno. So hi, I'm Jen Horowitz. I'm the Policy and Research Director for Let's Grow Kids. And we want to share a little bit about our recent legislative win in Vermont and how that has really impacted long-term sustainable funding for our ECE system in the state. So if you can go to the next slide, Bruno. Thank you. And just to give folks a little bit of context about our work, and I think this ties into some of the advocacy questions I've been seeing come through the chat. This, like Libby was saying, it is a journey, and we are, only partway there. But Let's Grow Kids was formed back in 2014 as a time-bound 10-year campaign with the intent to create a more equitable, accessible, and affordable early childhood education system in the state of Vermont. There had been, over the years, a lot of advocacy from so many different partners and early childhood educators. There had been investments from philanthropy, a lot of intention set to mentoring for childcare programs, as well as technical assistance. And our founders really realized that there was a need to have investment made to raise awareness of just why it was so important to invest in the early childhood education system. When Let's Grow Kids was founded, there weren't many Vermonters who believed that it was important to invest in kids' earliest years. So over time, our campaign has gone through this trajectory of focusing on public education. When we started, we were literally doing spaghetti dinners around the state with like infographic placemats. And then over time, we've used polling as a way to kind of garner public interest and understanding in this issue and to guide our strategy over the years to get us to this place where we could have this amazing win for kids with long-term sustainable investment. We also then pivoted to defining the problem and then defining the solution. And along the way, we don't have a lot of time to get into it, but along the way, we've done visioning work throughout the state with partners. We've had a Blue Ribbon Commission on how to finance high quality, affordable childcare, like Libby was saying. Being able to put that big number out there is really challenging. So having these various advocacy tools that allow you to be able to contextualize just how much that investment is going to cost so that you can get to a place of then how are we going to fund it is so critically important. So we've had a various strategies we've used along the way to get there. I'm going to turn it over to Drake really quickly to talk a little bit about the context of Vermont, and then we'll come back to talk more about the bill and the actual funding.
Great. Thanks, Jen. And hi, everyone. My name is Drake Turner. I'm the Government Relations Director at Let's Grow Kids, and really excited to have a few minutes to talk to you all. I think we'd love to talk about this for hours, as many of you probably would too. But before we dive into what is in the legislation that passed in Vermont this year, I just want to touch a little bit on our advocacy context in Vermont, because it really does impact how we do this work. And it's been really integral to our strategy is to, really be place-based. So the first thing I want to mention, which I think is not going to come to a shock to anyone, is that Vermont is a very small state. Our entire population is about 625,000 people, which, is the size of a neighborhood in some larger cities. So it definitely impacts how we work. We have 150 members of our state legislature, 180. We have 150 House members and 30 members of the Senate. So there are a lot of folks who have very small districts, which means they really do know everyone. So relational organizing is really important to us. And we have a lot of folks who are able to, walk down the street and talk to their legislator. So that's really a huge part of the work that we do. We also have a citizen legislature. I know there are a lot of other states that do as well. So we don't have a full-time legislature. Our legislators do not have staff. And so in a lot of ways, we like to see ourselves as filling that role for folks. We bring research, we bring policy, data, we show up and support our legislators to do the work that they want to do. And there are a lot of legislators in Vermont that have big goals that want to make really big change on a lot of issues. And it would be really impossible to do that without advocates and without organizations that are here to support them. Our legislature convenes every year from January until about May or June. So we do have, more time than some states do to do our policy work. And we also have legislative biennium. So every 2 years in Vermont, every seat is up for election. Our governor, lieutenant governor, every House seat, every Senate seat. So we have these 2-year chunks to get things done, which means we have to move quickly. And another layer to that is that in our last election, which was in 2022, I believe a third or more of the House and Senate turned over. So a lot of folks retired. We have a pretty aging legislature. And so this year in 2023, which is the first year of our current biennium, we had a ton of new legislators. And we'll get into a little bit more of what that meant for us in a few slides. We're a heavily Democratic state. Again, I think a lot of folks see Vermont as this progressive bastion in our country, but we also have, and that's true, we have Democratic supermajorities in the House and the Senate, but we also have a Republican governor, and he's extremely popular. I believe right now he's the most popular governor in the country. He has a 76% approval rate, I think, the last time we checked. And he's also not afraid of his veto pen. He has vetoed more legislation than I think every governor in Vermont history combined. So it makes for a really interesting advocacy environment where we have a very Democratic legislature, a governor who's not afraid to veto those bills, and also veto-proof majorities in the House and Senate. As I mentioned, all of our offices are up for election every 2 years. So we've actually played a larger role in elections in the past couple of years. That's a new strategy we've employed that's been really successful for us. There are a lot of issues that are important to Vermonters and important to our legislature. Early childhood education definitely was one that rose to the top this year, but we have a major housing crisis. There's a lot of work around climate change, other issues in the early childhood space, including paid family and medical leave, and a really robust advocacy community working on all of those issues. So there's a lot going on, and it's a small state, but we have a lot of interesting work that we get to be part of. So we can go to the next slide. So Jen's going to touch a little bit on the bill that passed this year. And then we're going to talk about some strategies that have been really successful for us and hopefully have some time for questions. But essentially this year, the Vermont legislature passed the 2023 childcare bill, which is now law. It's Act 76. And it's a major win for early childhood education in Vermont. But as Libby said, we're not done yet. I think that's a very common refrain among advocates in this space, and we're certainly no different. But just at the highest level, what this bill does is it stabilizes our early childhood education sector, invest in capacity development, and it really makes significant progress on providing access to affordable, quality early childhood education for all Vermont families who need it. Really exciting part of the bill is that it includes a long-term sustainable public investment in our childcare system. And when fully implemented, we have a staggered implementation timeline over the next year and a half. This bill will invest annually $125 million in our early childhood education system, which for a small state like Vermont is a lot of money. So we can go to the next slide, and then Jen's going to talk a little bit about what is in the bill.
Thanks, Drake. So I'm going to just spend literally like a few seconds on this so we can really talk about the financing part. So the main thing that I want to specify is that through this funding, the majority of it is going to greatly expanding Vermont's childcare subsidy system. So we are using subsidy as a vehicle to increase early childhood educator wages, make investments in capacity development, increase quality, support more families, make it more affordable, using subsidy as this vehicle. So a lot of these things that we're talking about fall under, in Vermont, we call it childcare financial assistance. But really, subsidy is the vehicle through which a lot of this funding is flowing. There are some other piecemeal projects and intentional programs created to support both the early childhood education workforce as well as programs. But a lot of the funding flows through this. So Bruno, if you could go to the next slide. So as Drake was saying, 125 million is what we are working up towards. And just for context, I started with a campaign very early on, and in our first session doing legislative advocacy, we were over the moon excited to secure $1 million. That was like groundbreaking amounts of funding for the early childhood education system and like an increase in the state budget. So now we're talking 125 million. So we've come a long way in the past few years. As Drake was saying, this is staggered implementation in the new fiscal year. So the fiscal year that just started, 2024, the bill is funded through a combination of one-time dollars, as well as increasing the base appropriation for our childcare subsidy program. Once this new funding goes into effect, it is coming through a payroll tax. So it has been years in the making of getting to a place where we could even talk about new tax revenue. As Drake was describing, we have a Republican governor. While he is beloved by folks from all different political persuasions, he still is fiscally conservative. And so it has taken years of working with community members and especially members of our business community. During the pandemic, after years of working with them to really help businesses better understand why childcare is so critical to their long-term success, a group of business leaders came together and sat down and said, we want to do some intentional thinking and work on this. How can Let's Grow Kids support us in doing that work? And we said, okay, we can connect you with some really fabulous folks, including the former tax commissioner who can help provide you some information. And they really sat down and thought through all the various options, ran tons of numbers, and came to the conclusion that a payroll tax is the thing that they as a business community wanted to advocate for. It also came out in a number of reports that were released by independent consultants over the years that this might be a viable option. And during this legislative session, legislators considered a number of different strategies, with the payroll tax ending up being the one that it seemed folks coalesced around, both the business community as well as legislators. And then when you run the numbers, it seems like a very viable option. So the new payroll tax will be a 0.44%. So it's not even a full percent, not even full 0.5% payroll tax that is split between employers and employees. Employers will pay 0.33% and employees will pay 0.11%. This tax also applies to self-employed individuals, and they will pay the employee share of 0.11%. All of the funds coming from this payroll tax will go to a child care special fund that will be helping to support that expansion of child care subsidy to include so many more kids and families, and also bringing rates up, working towards cost of care reimbursement rates, working towards covering a very large number of kids and families in the state, and really enabling programs to be able to pay early childhood educator competitive wages and benefits. So there's a lot that is coming through this idea of the payroll tax and being able to be funded through this particular mechanism. This payroll tax, again, will just combine with that increase in base funding and some of these other funding sources to create this holistic blending and braiding of funding that is going to support Vermont's early childhood education system over the long term.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Drake and Bruno as well. I want to make sure we have time for some Q&A from folks who've gotten some good questions and a couple questions repeatedly from folks. So Bruno, if you want to pull down the slides, we can spotlight that whole group so we can have a little bit of discussion. Vermont, I'll throw this question to you all first and just ask, what were some of the talking points that you all used, and were there some differences in talking points used with different stakeholder groups as you were advocating specifically for this big new dedication of a new payroll tax? That seems like something that would be potentially challenging to message.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Jen, feel free to jump in. We ended up being in an interesting place where we had done a lot of work with our business community, and they were the ones that really, the folks that we were working with were the ones that had elevated the payroll tax as their preferred funding mechanism. But we actually made the strategic decision this year to not go into the legislature with a preferred funding mechanism for the bill. So we really stuck with saying what we know about this bill, what we know about what's needed in Vermont in our childcare system is that we need dedicated, sustained, long-term funding and revenue to support our system, and it needs to be broad-based. But we made the decision that it would not really benefit us to come in for any one funding mechanism over another. That was really a decision that was up to the legislature to make. So we really stuck with what's the best policy that we can advocate for that's going to support our early childhood education system, elevated the voices of others, including early childhood educators, a lot of our business champions, and just worked really closely with our legislative champions to lead on the issue and to own it. And it was very difficult to do that. I will also say, I think there are a lot of times where we wanted to come down in favor of one funding mechanism over another. And as a little bit of additional context, there have been a number of legislative sessions where the payroll tax was identified as a potential funding mechanism for other issues, and they were all unsuccessful. So there was also wrapped up in the payroll tax, specifically in Vermont, and what issue it was going to be used for. So we just stayed really disciplined and focusing on what was needed in our childcare system, and let those conversations and decisions happen, with our legislative leadership. But I do think that the discussion around talking points, we were really disciplined in what we talked about. We need high quality, affordable, accessible childcare. There are so many arguments for why that's needed. And one thing I saw a question about, what was a message that worked for conservative legislators. The economic impact of investing in childcare we found to be really resonant with folks across the political spectrum, because we had seen how a lack of access to affordable, quality early childhood education was affecting not only children and families, but also our state's economy. So that was really effective. And there really was a way in for everyone to care about the issue. I don't know, Jen, if you want to add anything to that.
In terms of that economic impact, just a shout out to Libby, because we modeled Louisiana's economic impact study. We saw them do it and we're like, that's amazing. We should do that too. And we continued to build out. One thing I didn't mention is kind of part of my job is also doing a lot of research-based work and making sure that the campaign stays credible and fact-based. Every single thing we are making sure is the most viable set of information we can provide to folks. And so over the years, we've curated this series of informational resource sheets. So it has included messaging that resonates with fiscal conservatives, with progressives. We, as Drake was saying, really trying to find information that's going to resonate with all of the key decision makers that are playing a part in determining both funding and also how the system moves forward. And there are so many states that have done excellent pieces of work. And we literally had conversations with Louisiana and a couple of other folks saying, tell us how you did this, what worked well, and then working with national technical assistance partners like Children's Funding Project to be able to really refine those materials, hone in on what works best, and using all the resources available to create a very tight set of materials.
And I will say, I agree with all the things that they're saying. That tight messaging has allowed us to have surround sound. So that tight messaging with that surround sound means that when there's an op-ed written, we probably have written it, but that the economic development and the workforce, like the language is there and it's unified, then we saw a gap and we were waiting for somebody else to do it. And it just never got filled. And so we created a workforce calculator for businesses to estimate what they themselves are losing. So we only have 2 Fortune 500 companies in the state of Louisiana. One of them let us use their data on our workforce calculator that I had dropped in the answer in the Q&A box. And so that it allowed Entergy, which is our energy company, to say we're losing an estimated $14 million annually due to childcare breakdowns. That means something. And when we soft launched that calculator, the CEO of Entergy was the one who soft launched it. And so like having that kind of dialogue with the business community has been critically important. And then somebody asked about the language. We've done a lot of work through Alliance for Early Success with the Right for Kids group. That's been, I would say, really has helped us change the game of how we talk about young children in our state. Like parents are always the first teachers. We all know that, but you only have one right way to do it right the first time. And like making sure we're using those types of that language has helped us with the economic case and with, a very fiscally conservative legislature who's trying to make decisions for the long haul of Louisiana that they think will help us benefit for years to come.
And I just want to dig in a little bit because folks might be wondering, okay, well, how do I get that economic impact research done? How do I get the messaging work done? And how do I get the research into a menu of revenue options to present, even if I'm not going to say I picked one of the other? I know Drake and Jen, you all did that work in Vermont, and you all did that differently. You all, I think, funded that work and did that work through different channels. So Libby, I'm wondering if you could share how you all did that work and the role philanthropy or other funding played in that. And then Drake and Jen, maybe you can share how you all got that work done too.
Sure. So one thing to know about us at the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children, we take no public dollars. So when we stand up for children, we're standing up for children. We're not worrying where our money is coming from. So when we did our Losing Ground report, which was our economic impact work, Entergy, they funded it for us. And we were able to garner resources from other funders. And then as we think about how we did our workforce calculator, again, it was through philanthropy because we had made the case with economic impact of how we've been able to basically grow the pot in Louisiana related to revenue in multiple different streams. So that has been helpful. We can't do this work without philanthropy and private donors. That's how we've been able to fund it. And just like Drake and Jen, like, we lead with data and research. None of us get paid for our feelings, and quite frankly, nobody wants them. We have to lead with data and research, and that's how we're able to thin a very, very tiny needle in a very, very fiscally conservative state. We stay in that lane. We try to stay out of emotion and just drive the economic impact and workforce issues are related to early care and education. And you don't want to waste a disaster. And COVID was a colossal disaster, but it allowed us to shine a light on the impact of early care and education on our economy.
Thanks, Libby. Drake and Jen, what about you all? I know you funded that work very differently.
Yeah, so we've used a number of different strategies over the years to support that work. Some of it, we are very fortunate to have a policy and research team. So we have some folks dedicated to being able to do some of that work in-house. Again, as Olivia was saying, have relied on philanthropic dollars to really help support some of those initiatives. Sometimes we've contracted with consultants because the Let's Grow Kids name being on something is not going to be effective. Folks need to see it coming from other folks. So we've partnered in the past with Vermont Business Roundtable, Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility, help them to get the information they need, connected them with consultants, and they have published some of the work, some of the information that came out on really what does this mean for Vermont's economy and why is this a smart economic investment for the state. So and then in other ways, we had the Blue Ribbon Commission for Early Childhood for investing in high quality, affordable childcare in the state. We've had a think tank that was independent and run through our state's public-private partnership for early childhood. There's been a number of different groups that have really helped to support making this work available, doing the work. Let's Grow Kids is usually at the table, but not always. And it's really trying to figure out which voice is the best voice in order to reach the legislators who need to hear the message.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Drake. And we lost Libby because I know she had a hard stop at 3, and it's 3. So I just want to say thank you to both of you for participating, and thank you to Bruno for putting together these examples for folks. I know we just did a shallow dive into the huge range of examples that were on some of those slides, and there's much more to both the Vermont and Louisiana stories. We're going to share obviously these slides out, and we're going to put together a slide at the end of the deck that has a bunch of the links that folks shared in the chat in it. I also want to say that Bruno and some of our team members are working on a large paper or policy brief that will answer some of the Q&A questions we didn't get to, particularly about things like, okay, what's the governance structure of where these funds go? What are the difference between where these funds land in different places? I know those were several questions we got. And thank you all for your robust engagement. And thank you to the Alliance for Early Success grantees who attended. Please expect some opportunities for continued conversation on this topic. And in the chat, I know we're dropping Bruno's contact information and information about our website and how to reach us, but you should also get an email from us. So thank you so much, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.